Hello, ULF. This is Chairman Jack. Today we are quickly going to do a little what is the difference between nationalization under capitalism and what is nationalization under socialism. And now to give a quick definition, actually to introduce the people, my apologies. I will be introducing
Volgin.
and
Red Star.
and then to hand it to you, Red Star, I'll let you read a basic definition.
A basic definition of nationalization is a transfer of a major branch of industry or commerce from private to state ownership or control.
Yeah, I think to quickly give an example would be, when things get nationalized in the United States, like a lot of basic utilities, they're quickly sold off to state monopolies, like DTE, things like that, the electrical boards, things like that. Or in Europe, where they're nationalized to make things more accessible, like Volvo and various other, like the NHS is now being sold off whole stake. And that's not even really much. It technically is an industry, or like oil, or another great example across Europe is nationalized in Norway, but that's used to make it more accessible and easier to sell to aid the state apparatus. Versus you look at it in Cuba, where they nationalized all the plantations to give them back to the people. It wasn't to aid a corporation or anything or aid capitalism. It was to, in a sense, aid the people and give the people their land. And I think that's the biggest contrast of the two.
Yeah, I would definitely agree on that. And really to understand the difference between nationalization, that's really kind of the problem that a lot of these like anarchists and stuff have. They say that, oh, well, these are just quote unquote state capitalist countries because they didn't do nationalization. It's not really workers' control, but you're not understanding the class character of these countries like Cuba or the USSR or Venezuela or whatnot that are nationalizing them for the sake because it's the proletariat, the people that control these state apparatus. That's the ruling class. While in these capitalist countries like Europe or the US, it's the bourgeoisie. So nationalization there would only benefit them.
Yeah, I think to expand is to also look at it in the sense of like, who is the end all be all most affected by these certain things. So like when plantations or massive amounts of land were nationalized, what happened in Cuba? Well, slave owners and basically like both slave owners and those basically slave owners who had sharecroppers were tossed out, and the people, either slaves or peasantry, were given these lands to control, and they were most affected by it. Versus when you nationalized certain parts of West Virginia, for example, and Appalachia, and they started to build major dams, what did it do? It flooded the poorest people, and they started to have to flee up to northern states to get jobs because their homes they lived in for a century had just been destroyed by the U.S. government. And that is just to give people electricity. So let's look at who is most affected by what. And I think that's another fundamental difference, is the poor being most affected by one thing versus they're negatively affected by one thing versus being positively affected by another. Red Star, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I think you guys like the basics out of the way. I'm thinking of like just like examples of like certain nations and I guess kind of like socialist countries, where like nationalization occurred, and like sort of the conflict between like the capitalist state versus say like an emerging socialist state, because often we see how capitalist countries really dislike, especially socialist nations nationalizing their industry. But of course, historically, they, say the United States, they've always gone in to intervene against like nationalization, like say in Iran or Chile and etc.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's it's a perfect example is what happens when other countries try to nationalize and they aren't socialist. If it gets in the way of Western capitalism, they overthrow that country and try to topple it. Like what, as you just said, what happened to Allende after he nationalized copper, or what happened to Mossadegh after he nationalized oil in Iran. I think it's very, very emblematic of things where if someone tries to nationalize in the West, that's fine. They'll do that for whatever reason and try to eventually sell it off whole stake. Yet then, if a nation in the global south tries to nationalize, they're quickly tossed out and overthrown. Or if it's a socialist nation, they try to sanction them to death and try to basically destroy them in any possible way they can, like what's happening in Venezuela, where they just put a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head. And I think it's very, very emblematic of how things work. Yeah, but I think to give a quick another quick brief just definition, so it's reset there, is basically nationalization under capitalism is basically to take a private industry and nationalize it in order to make it more accessible to sell, and then eventually normally sell it off for private stake, like what's happening to the NHS right now, what's happened across the board in the United States with the electric companies, what's happened with telephone companies, et cetera, versus what nationalization means under socialism is to take something that was formerly owned by capitalists and then give that to the people. That is the most fundamental split in the two, and that is basically to define them both. One is to help capital, one is to help the people, and that comes down to the basic fundamental cause and effect of how things work in both of these countries. It will never be allowed to massively help the people with nationalization in the West because that is not beneficial. Because look at what's happening to the National Healthcare Service, I think is a perfect example of this. It's being destroyed, eradicated, and sold off whole stake to the United States. And then look at what happened in, Cuba, where they gave all the land back to the people, or in Venezuela, which may not be socialist or whatever, but is still a progressive state. They nationalized oil and gave everyone a job, a guaranteed job from it. I think that is the most fundamental difference. Anyway, I have been Chairman Jack.
Volgin.
And this has been Red Star.
Thank you so much for listening.